What was the relationship like with your dad? This podcast, Military Veteran Dad, is brought to you by the Business of Fatherhood, an effort by me to help you become a better dad. By helping dads create a lasting feeling of change on the inside, help them grow through generational trauma, and by redefining the definition of living. There is more to life than being alive. To find out more information about this, head on over to bencloy.com or check out the Business of Fatherhood podcast on any and all platforms.
Dory 1, this is Fire Team Delta. Dad's coming home.
Welcome to the Military Veteran Dad Podcast, where it is our mission to bring every dad home. I am your host, Ben Cloy. I'm a United States Marine veteran, husband, and a father. We will bring authentic conversations to inspire action in your life so we can close the gap between the dad you are today and the dad you want to be tomorrow. This is the Military Veteran Dad Podcast.
Hey, welcome back. This is episode 158, and we're going to flip the script on the entire podcast. We're going to do something that I've never done. We're going to throw out the interview show for a few weeks, and we're going to dive into some deep content from the history of this podcast, the lessons of this podcast, and we're going to dedicate it towards the primary focus of why this podcast currently exists, to bring every dad home. Coming home from the military is one of the hardest processes, whether you're coming home from deployment or whether you're coming home from your transition out and you're trying to integrate back into the civilian world. All of this content can apply in the same way, depending on how your season of life has unfolded, depending on how your military career has unfolded as well. But today we're going to start what is a 4-part series. Today is part 1, and today we're calling it the honeymoon phase of military deployment. And this is the coming home part. The videos that we all love and know and cry, because I can tell you every one of those videos makes me cry every single time. Doesn't even matter if I've seen the video before. It can pull my heartstrings and get me crying instantly. I would love to hear your feedback on this 4-part series. Drop me an email, ben@militaryveterandad.com. Let me know what you liked. Let me know what hit home. Let me know what really resonated. Maybe you wanted more of. Maybe there was a part that I flew over. Whatever it may be, I'd love to hear your feedback. So without further ado, let's get diving into part 1, the honeymoon phase of coming home. In this first part, I want to dive into the most common phase that almost all Americans know because we see the videos all over social media. And this is the honeymoon phase. It's those coming home celebrations where the person's coming off the airplane and the families reunite, or there's those videos in school where the dad or the mom surprises their kid and everything erupts in tears, and just it's very difficult to hold those tears back when you see those kind of videos. And it's hard, and it almost puts a billboard for the rest of the world to think like, oh man, everything's going to be better. Everything's okay now. Well, yes, it is okay now. And yes, you don't have to worry about your husband or your spouse really dying in this moment. It is still a very difficult phase to go through, mainly because we don't consider it a phase. The most important part that I think you'll get out of all of these parts that I'm going to diagnose here and talk about is acknowledging that there is a phase, that there is a process, is the most fundamental part, that this isn't just something like a light switch that you turn back on and life resumes. It may look like that. It may be a desire to go to that point. But really, the honeymoon phase is just the beginning. And also remember that it is a phase, that this is just the first phase to get through this. And there is a process to get through this. I've interviewed 150 dads in this podcast. In those conversations is the gold that has come out and into these parts and into this series on coming home. Don't be surprised when you're going through this phase. This is the phase where a lot of random things can happen. A lot of unexpected things can happen. And it's these unexpected things that can really get us distorted from off track of like, oh man, how is this going to work out? Is our marriage even going to be able to make it through? Whatever it may be, the thoughts of what could happen kind of get out of control in this phase. Now, I should also season before we get too far into this parts, I have never gone through this process personally. This advice comes to you from listening to other dads on this podcast as the culmination of all their advice on what the best process is for coming home. It's checking in with them in those conversations. Hey, What did you learn in that process? What did you do wrong? What did you do right? And what advice would you give to someone else out there? And it's, to me, this process, I keep going back to process and a phase, because those are two things that I think will remind you to get through this, that there is a part where the honeymoon phase ends. Just like in marriage, the honeymoon phase ends, and usually it ends right around when you have your first kid, and you're like, what part of us thought this was a good idea? And then you do it again, and then you do it again, and you're like, why do we keep doing this? Every time we have to relearn all these lessons, like screaming babies keep you up at night. I value my sleep. Just like raising a kid. That's a phase. There's a phase when they don't sleep. There's a phase when they're terrible twos. There's a phase when they're trying threes. It's these phases that we ignore, but we also don't give it proper focus. We don't give it acknowledgement that, you know what, this is just going to end one day. And this is going to move on to the next phase. Life is always changing. And this process of coming home from wherever, coming home from a deployment, coming home from a TAD, coming home from war, coming home from a deployment overseas for a year, whatever it may be, the process is still very similar. And we're going to get through it together. This 4-part series is going to dive into the areas of this process that I have learned over the course of this podcast. This course has been a long time coming. This information has been sowed through all of these episodes, and I've been working on this in the background for a while, and I'm really excited to bring it to you now. I also want to give you some ideas and framework to look at this phase in a different way. Remember that how these videos look, they look good on TV, but they often don't reflect the reality. Again, I want you to understand the honeymoon phase reality is, yes, it's good to be back. Yes, it's good to be back in each other's arms, but it's also kind of a mirage because it's going to quickly fade away. And maybe it's going to be filled with anger. Maybe it's going to be filled with resentment. Maybe it's going to be filled with kids yelling at you. Whatever it may be, understand it is a phase. So let's dive into the core of the honeymoon phase. Why does it become the honeymoon phase? Why does it fade away so quickly? Why isn't it a feeling that we could hold on to that lasts forever? It could last forever. But the problem is we have all this other baggage in the way. We have stuff coming home from wherever we came home from. We have thoughts and stories that haven't been processed, so we've suppressed a lot of things to stay alive. All of those ideas can get lost. All of those ideas can get mixed up into the soup of what it can be to be a family. So in the first lesson I wanted you to understand in the honeymoon phase is time is like a credit card. You need to pay it back with interest. Part of the work from this phase onward is realizing that while you were gone, you borrowed time. You borrowed memories with playing with your kids. You borrowed time with physical intimacy and physical sex with your partner. All of these things have to be paid back. They were okay. Your family understands what you were doing. But you don't just get to ignore the credit card debt. You don't get just to pretend that life can just resume. There is a fee that you need to pay coming home. This shows up in switching your priorities, and make sure that you don't just double down back into work, because that is the key part that's going to have the wheels fall off the wagon fairly quick here. It's this area that we really can mess up. Time is like a credit card, and we need to pay it back with interest. I want you to imagine something. Imagine your 14-year-old son, while you were away, had his first girlfriend. Now, maybe you knew that. But what you may not have known is the breakup, the fight, the issue. Whatever issue that might have come from that relationship, the rejection. Maybe it did. Maybe he asked someone out and he was rejected. Understanding that your son has a ball of emotions and they're dressed up with anger. And he's going to bring you anger because he's pissed that you weren't there to talk to him when he needed you. That you were off out fighting a war and making everybody else more important than him. Because in his world, what he was going through was more important than what you were going through. Now, as an adult, that sounds very irrational. But to a 14-year-old, that's how they're going to see the world. Same thing can apply to your daughter. Imagine if she was going through a relationship or a breakup or a boyfriend or rejection, whatever it may be. There was a feeling that they wanted to tell you when it happened and you weren't there. That resentment is going to get in the way of your relationship with them. The same thing could happen with your wife. There could have been a budget issue. There could have been a car issue. There could have been a breakdown on the interstate somewhere, and she had to figure it out. There could have been an issue at school, and she was alone to walk her kids through it. You weren't there to do it. This doesn't put the blame on you for doing what you do. And this doesn't even acknowledge what they already know, that you were doing what you needed to do. But the emotion is still there. Emotions aren't logical. They don't need logic to exist. They just exist. And so logic isn't a way to get through this. So when you think of this honeymoon phase, I truly need you to understand that life was happening without you. And this honeymoon phase fades very quickly because of the process that we're talking about. Because there were so many moments. The time credit card is so big right now. Once they can physically hold you in their arms, the emotions of all those times that you weren't there start coming up. And depending on how old your kids are, they don't know where these emotions are coming from. There's kind of a golden rule that I deal with my kids, that whatever they do bring me, whether it be a real anger emotion or whether it be an intense emotion, the true issue is always on the opposite side of the room in a different category than they're bringing me. It's almost always in some different place. Like the root issue that they're bringing me isn't the root issue. And I think that in your mode from coming home from this honeymoon phase is you need to understand whatever your wife, your partner, your kids, whatever they're bringing you, be curious about where could this else be coming from? Because it's this detective phase in the very beginning that's going to allow you to move through this process quicker, be stronger, and rebuild your family ties in even a deeper foundational way that every time you deploy only gets stronger and stronger. I also want to spend some time on this part acknowledging that your honeymoon phase also applies to you. That you've been deployed wherever you were at. And you just thought about this moment, the one of you holding your partner, your kids in your arms and giving them the biggest hug in the world is the only moment that you've ever thought of. It was the moment that kept you alive. You were in Iraq thinking about this moment. This moment was the one that kept you alive. I can't just wait one more day. I can wait one more day to get to that moment. And then it comes. And you experience it. And then on the next day, you have to acknowledge the work of, that moment's gone. Now what? What pulled me forward to keep going? What pulls me forward into the future to keep this process moving so I don't get stuck? Realize, Dad, that this podcast exists because of a moment that happened September 18th, 2018. I was at a conference telling my story about coming home just as a dad and emotionally to myself. I made another military spouse cry with that story. Now remember, I was not in a deployed state. I never had to go through this process with the family. But my story still brought this woman to tears. And I didn't understand why until she told me. And she said these words, and I want you to sit in these words and truly feel them. My husband came home from war physically, but he didn't come home from war emotionally. He's just on autopilot and sits on the couch. Think about that. This honeymoon phase, that feeling, is step one. Step one of the process is acknowledging where you are and getting back to living. So that way, because that feeling of, I just need to live for this moment is over. It happened in a blink of an eye. I've waited maybe a year to feel that, and then I did. And now you're left with this hangover of, now what? Now what? What do I do next? It is this moment where you need to ask the hard questions of, how am I feeling? Why do I feel that way? What am I not acknowledging? Reverse psychology yourself. When you blow up at your kid, your spouse, your partner, anyone, when you blow up at them, ask yourself, is this the issue that I'm blowing up over? Or is this the thing that I'm expressing and my issue is actually on the other side of the room? Because I can tell you often than not, what dads bring to the surface is never really the issue. The issue is always at the roots. The issue is always at the roots. Ask yourself those questions. Be a detective in your own life. Take notes. Take notes of how you feel in certain times. If you feel really agitated when you go to the grocery store, a very common place for anyone who's been to war, to feel agitated. Write down, today, I felt agitated at the grocery store. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself why 5 times. Asking yourself why 5 times helps get to the root of why that might be there. You have the tools to get through this. The honeymoon phase is just the beginning. It has amazing sex. It has amazing connection. It has amazing memories, amazing video. But it is just the beginning of this process to come home. Everything that I have done in this podcast has been to help dads come home. This is the process. This is the existence of this podcast, to help you physically come home so that you can emotionally come home. Because it's the emotional frontier of life that is going to move you to the places that you always wanted to be. We don't acknowledge it. We don't acknowledge there's a process. We act like there's not a process, even though in the military there's a process for everything. But the military has no military orders for coming home and reintegrating with your family. If they did, it's probably like 3 bullet points. Because we spend 6 months training for war, and we spend about 3 or 4 getting ready to come home. That ratio needs to change. Understand this first part, the honeymoon phase, is just the beginning. But I know if you're listening to this podcast and this course, you're listening to information that's going to help you. You're asking the right questions. You're looking for other ideas on how to do this. You're looking for others to give you access to the language to help you come home. Almost always, in the context of this emotional process, it's language. We don't have the language to articulate how we feel, so we don't know how to put words to it, and we don't put words to it, we don't know how to feel. There are many times where a dad will be listening to this podcast, and when he says something, or when a guest says something, or when I say something, they start to feel something they've never felt because they got words to a feeling they've been trying to figure out, but they haven't been able to understand. This concludes part 1, and look forward to being back with you in part 2. Thank you for listening to part 1 of Coming Home, a series on military deployments and the process to do it correctly and how to avoid the pitfalls that can often happen to dads and military families that experience military deployment and have to welcome someone back after being gone for a long time. Like I said in the beginning, I would love to hear your feedback. If this really resonated, if you want more, if you want to know something in the future parts, because they've got to be recorded, drop me an email, ben@militaryveterandad.com. Guys, that is all we have for this week. Again, look forward to part 2 next week. Other than that, have a great week, and we'll talk soon.